You did well. We'll do that again. Kind of fun. So I wanted to start out this morning with a story about a couple of people that I knew when I was in seminary in Denver. And I've decided to not use real names or that sort of thing. You might remember there's a famous TV show that used to say the story you've just seen is true, but the names have been changed to protect the innocent. So know that the names have changed, but the facts of the story remain the same. But I had a clergy colleague when I was in seminary that became aware of a particular situation of a young teenage girl. I'll call her Holly. But Holly had made some poor choices and had really found herself in a bit of a tight situation. Weeks before, her parents had kicked her out of the house. And as she got kicked out of her parents' house, there were grandparents living not too far behind. So she went and was able to stay in a room in the grandparents' basement. And when the grandparents discovered that she had been smoking in her room in the basement, they also kicked her out because that was not part of the agreement that they had with her. And so Holly had been living in her car. She had dropped out of high school. She was hungry. She didn't have any money. She was kind of desperate when my clergy friend became aware of her situation. The place where my friend was staying had a room that wasn't being used at all, and so she invited her to stay in that room. This happened to be around October, and the nights were getting a little chilly in Denver, as you can imagine, in October, and so the situation really was quite desired. It was a dire situation for Holly. And so she moved in, and there were rules, of course, but there was also grace, and those two things sometimes have to go together. But my clergy friend began to work with Holly a little bit, and they managed to get together and figure out some of the things that were wrong with her automobile. And my clergy friend managed to get the car running decently again, paid for some new parts and the tune-up and some of those kinds of things. And finally, with a safe place to stay and some reliable transportation and the ability to sort of function, not living in her car, Holly was able to then begin to look for work, or they began to have conversations about a long-term transition into what society expected, and kind of some of those issues that were there. It was at that time that they began to talk about employment and finding a job and all that the discussion turned toward this issue that she had dropped out of high school. And so my clergy friend knew of a high school close by that was offering GED classes in the evening. And so she signed Holly up to attend these GED classes and kind of monitored her, to remind her that you gotta go to class and, you need to participate, you need to show up here, because if you don't, it's not going to end well. And so there was all of that going on. And by this time, it was in the middle of the Christmas season. And Holly was still estranged from parents and grandparents alike. And so my clergy friend welcomed her into the family Christmas activities. And they, attended the candlelight service together, and they exchanged gifts, and they had Christmas dinner with Holly. And they did all of these things just to let her know that there was somebody out there, that cared. Somebody loved her. And that through this difficult time, and what would have been a very lonely time, that she felt supported and that she felt like, she was a human being worthy of somebody's attention and affection. Well, January came, and the GED program distributed sample questions and topics to study for this test that was going to take place in late January. And at that time, my colleague, my clergy friend, discovered that Holly had absolutely zero academic experience about how to study for a test, how to take a test, how to prepare for a test. Nothing. I mean, just absolutely no experience at all. I mean, it's no wonder she dropped out of high school. She couldn't take a test. I mean, it was amazing. And so my friend set up a schedule, and they met almost every day during the week for about an hour every day in January. And my clergy colleague friend taught Holly how to study, how to look at a sample question, how to remember things, how to look at the topics and begin to absorb all of that information. Well, on a Saturday morning, late in January, Holly took her GED test, and she passed. And she was now a high school graduate. All during this time, my friend had insisted that Holly occasionally touch base with both her parents and her grandparents, to let them know where she was, to let them know that she was safe, to let them know that, even though the relationship was strained at that particular time, that she was okay. Well, she again checked in sometime after the Saturday morning test, where she passed, and she was now a high school graduate. And she checked in with her grandfather, and she began to tell her grandfather about everything that had happened and about everything that she had accomplished and about how they had studied together with this friend of mine and how she began to learn new skills and how eventually she took the test and she passed. And she now she has her high school diploma and she's ready to look for work, and it was good. And what I feel like was the first time in maybe her entire life she was experiencing some level of self-esteem, benefiting from a little bit of a positive self-image. She had accomplished something that, things were going good. She had received some compliments. Things were looking up. Well, on Monday morning, after the Saturday morning test, my friend got a phone call from the grandfather, and he was upset. And he used derogatory language, and he swore at her and said that she had stuck her nose into family business that was none of her business. And now she had, helped Holly study and filled her head with all kinds of these strange ideas about accomplishing something, and she'd gotten her GED. It's not the same thing as a high school diploma. I mean, he was really upset. And he ended the conversation right before he hung up on her. He said, "You've gone and you've done all of these things and helped her study and gotten her GED, and have you ever thought about how that made me feel?" That's what he said. And then hung up the phone. Well, the saga continues, but I'm going to stop right here. And what I want you to take from the story, what I want you to glean from this experience of my friend, is that sometimes love is vulnerable. Okay? Love can be vulnerable. And when we pursue a life of love, we open ourselves up sometimes. We put ourselves into a vulnerable position. So we have been on this quest for the last several weeks now, where we have been looking at this thing called God's love, the love of God. And I've tried to be brutally honest with you that, sometimes the love of God can seem rather elusive. It's hard for us to find it sometimes. Hard for us to recognize that it's there when we're in the midst of some catastrophe, or we're in the midst of some personal crisis, or something takes place that makes us question the love of God. And we look around at the world and we see, all of this human suffering, all of this struggling that's taking place, and all of this hunger and violence and things that just shouldn't happen. And then something like, the Florida shooting pops up. It just becomes this weight. And we think to ourselves, where is the love of God? Where is God's love? And part of our problems around that understanding, part of our situation that we find ourselves in, is the way that we image the divine, the way that we think about God. And when we interject our human likeness into God's love, when we begin to think about God's love as